So today we're going to be learning all about anxiety. Before we get started with the video though, I just want to give a quick disclaimer just like I do with all these other psychology videos on my channel. I'm not a professional, I'm not a psychologist. I am just a senior getting my undergrad bachelor's in psychology, and I took a few psychopathology classes, mental disorder classes, and these are just some things that I learned from those classes, so I just wanted to share and make it easy to understand. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started with what anxiety is. So anxiety is basically your body's response to any stress. It can be very mild, it can be very severe, and there's usually three extremities to like how your body reacts. Most cases, there's usually just a stressor that's tied to one instance. So let's say, for example, that you lose your phone and you start freaking out, you start getting like stressed out because you can't find your phone. But the minute that you find your phone, like that anxiety, that stress goes away. So that is considered like normal anxiety because your reaction to that kind of stressor goes away once it's been resolved. The second extremity can be considered to be subclinical general anxiety. This is kind of like where people worry a little bit more than most people. These people tend to get stuck in like their worry kind of thought process, but it eventually goes away and it's not very impairing and it doesn't disrupt their day-to-day life. So let's take an example of somebody having a cough, and now that we're in this whole pandemic, let's say that person has a cough and they start worrying and thinking, oh, how did I get this? Do I have COVID? Like they'll just kind of worry about that cough, but eventually it'll kind of fade away and it won't really be disruptive to their day-to-day life. And the third level of extremity is generalized anxiety disorder. This is an excessive, like uncontrollable worry about like day-to-day life. And the key to generalized anxiety disorder, aka GAD, is that the worry is disproportionate to reality. So I myself have generalized anxiety disorder. I have been diagnosed. I'm not self-diagnosing. A real life example that I face like every single day, like whenever I leave my house, is right before I open the door to leave to go to my car, to take out the trash, like just to leave my house, my mind just goes over and over thinking somebody's gonna come and kill me, somebody's gonna come and kidnap me, something bad's gonna happen, somebody's gonna shoot me. Like all of these unrealistic things start going in my mind, which makes me really stressed out. It's kind of like thinking something bad is going to happen to me. So whenever I get into my car, I immediately lock the door and I'm literally like, and the thing is, chances are none of that stuff is going to happen, but it just shows how like disproportionate those worries are to like reality. In regards to how prevalent it is, it's usually around 10% in childhood. It goes up to 20% in adolescence, and I can imagine that these numbers are even higher now. But it's much more common in girls than it is for boys. Usually tends to be how girls and boys are treated, how they're raised differently. They have like different standards and expectations, but it can also be biological, social, cultural differences. Some other disorders that can be comorbid with anxiety, meaning that it can be prevalent with anxiety. The highest one usually is depression, but there can also be ODD, CD, so oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorder, and having like some kind of substance abuse. So how does anxiety present? Well, there is the physiological, cognitive, and behavioral aspect to anxiety. Physiological is basically your body's reaction to stress. There's a lot of different ways that it can be shown, but very common ones can be shaking, heavy breathing, your heart is racing, it feels like it's coming out of its chest. Some people can feel that their chest is being like closed off and you feel like there's something stepping on you that you can't breathe. In terms of cognitive, this is basically the thought process of how you're thinking. Let's take the example of like me going to like the car when I'm alone or something. Like, what's gonna happen? Oh my god, am I gonna die? Somebody gonna come and kidnap me? That's kind of like the cognitive aspect of it. And lastly, the behavioral aspect. This is basically how you react behavior wise. So there's different ways that you can react. Very common, fight or flight. You can avoid, you can face it head on, you can freeze, or you can escape. When it comes to choosing how you deal with your anxiety, The worst thing possible that you can do is avoiding it. This is because it makes it much more difficult to deal with and face later on. Because the thing is, when you avoid your anxiety, it kind of makes your mind think that it's okay to be anxious, so it serves as a positive reinforcement. And over time, with people like me who tend to just ignore and avoid my anxiety, we tend to have it build up and up and up and eventually just explode down the line. Having fears, worries, and feelings of anxieties are normal and to be expected because it's part of our development. At 12 to 14 months, there is some separation anxiety. 3 to 6 year age, there is a fear of ghosts, the dark, animals. In the 6 to 11 year mark, there is some fear of like having harm done to like their bodies. Death is a concept that they start to process and understand. And lastly, adolescence, there is this fear and worry of any social concerns. So we can see that's very common depending on the age group. So just breaking down fear and worries. Fear, we can kind of know what it is based off of our flight or fight kind of instincts. So fears are basically triggered from like a stimulus. So with their fight or flight instinct, it's the way that your body chooses to react to a fear. So you can either choose to face it head on, the fight, or flight, which is just like running away. So moving along to worries, this is kind of like a kind of thought that's in your head. It's kind of like the anxiety of like possible future events, things that might happen. So for the etiology, meaning the causes, the origin of anxiety, there's kind of like 3 kind of factors to it. The first one being genetics. This plays 30% of it. The second one is the environment, which can play 20% of it. And the last one, the big chunk of it, 50% of it is not known. So for genetics, there's kind of like the heritability aspect and the neurobiology aspect. So heritability is basically if your parents have it, you might have a chance of getting it as well. So neurobiology is kind of like the way that your brain, the genes, everything that goes up in your coconut, how it works. So we have the amygdala, which kind of controls your fight or flight response, which is what I was kind of touching upon earlier. People with anxiety tend to have oversensitivity abnormalities. So your amygdala is kind of firing off a lot. And people with anxiety also tend to have kind of a lower ability in their prefrontal cortex. The HPA axis, which is kind of like the stress kind of center, that's kind of firing off a lot as well. And lastly, we can consider neurotransmitters having like a kind of dysfunction. The GABA neurotransmitter, this is kind of like the insulation neurotransmitter, meaning if you have too much of it, they tend to sleep a lot, be a little bit more slow. It's not to be like slow in the head of like being stupid, but it's more so of your body's creating a lot of that GABA neurotransmitter that there's not a lot of brain activity going on. So with the opposite of it, usually people with anxiety tend to possibly have less of the GABA neurotransmitter. So there's a lot going on in your head. Like there's a lot of brain activity, like the neural pathways, a lot of stuff happening. So in regards to the environment, there tends to be child factors and family factors. It can also be many other factors, but these are just the main 2 that I'm going to talk about now. So in regards to child factors, it kind of depends on how the child is raised. They could have had an insecure attachment, feeling like no control, feeling alone, having an emotional dysregulation, and having kind of like a lower stress threshold can kind of play into that as well. So in regards to family factors, there's kind of 2 kind of sections to this. The first one being how parents think, their mentality. So basically how they act, how they think, that behavior is going to be modeled onto the child. So kids tend to not really do what you say, and they tend to do whatever you do. They will copy that. So you know the saying that's like, do as I say, not as I do? It's the other way around. Do as I do, not as I say. And the second section to family factors in regards to parenting is the style of parenting. The style of parenting that is most harmful and can usually lead to children having some kind of anxiety is helicopter parenting. It's kind of like parents being overbearing and over controlling of the child's life. So we're gonna get to the juicy part, which is the types of anxiety disorders. I'm not gonna get really in depth with them because there's a lot. The first one is separation anxiety disorder. With all these disorders, I'm going to just be kind of referencing it more to children and how it presents to them because that is what I am more familiar with. So separation anxiety disorder is very common in children. It's basically having a fear of leaving that parental figure, and there's different symptoms that can occur. The first one being worrying about potentially being separated from that parental guardian. The second one being worrying about what will happen to that person if they leave. Another one being refusing to go to school. Some other ones are having like repeated nightmares, refusing to leave that parent's side because they feel that kind of comfort and feeling safe with that guardian, that parental figure. So the prevalence is usually 2 to 5% of children, and the age onset that we can see this happening is around 6.5 years old. So this next one is a specific phobia. So with phobia, that's having an intense fear of a specific stimulus, whether it be heights, water, animals, like different things, specific things that they have a fear of. So once that kind of stimulus is presented to the child, that will immediately provoke like any fear and anxiety that the child might have to that. There's a difference between having a fear and a phobia of something. So we're gonna take cockroaches for an example. Having a fear of cockroach is just kind of like, I want to be away from it, but it wouldn't be the end of the world if I saw one like 10 feet away from me. Somebody with a phobia of roaches would, even if it was a roach on like a TV screen, they would literally be freaking out, sweating. A phobia is kind of like a past the scale kind of fear, and it's very disproportionate to reality. So just like with separation anxiety disorder, the onset of the age for children tends to be 6.5 years old, but the prevalence rate is around 5 to 7%. And when going into adolescence, it kind of triples. It goes to around 15%. So our next anxiety disorder is social anxiety disorder. Social anxiety disorder is basically having a fear of being in social situations, having like some judgment on them, and they will do everything they can to avoid being in social situations. And the thing is with social anxiety disorder is that these social situations will always provoke that fear and anxiety to like an extreme level. So the age of onset is around 9.5 years old, and the prevalence rate is around 2 to 5%, and it's usually equal between boys and girls. So the next one I'm going to talk about is panic disorder. This is kind of known as an anxiety attack. So I forgot to mention this before, but the reason that I'm air quoting every time I say anxiety attack, it's because it's a street term used for panic attacks. So panic attack is basically like the formal word for it, but it can be used interchangeably. But panic attack is the formal word and anxiety attack is kind of like the street term for it. But the difference is that panic disorder is having that anxiety attack out of the blue. Like it will literally be random for no specific reason. The age of onset tends to be like 19 years old, and the prevalence rate tends to be 1 to 2%. And lastly, GAD, Generalized Anxiety Disorder. This is probably the most well-known type of anxiety, or this is what most people think of when they think of anxiety. So generalized anxiety disorder is just basically having a fear of everything and anything. Like I mentioned, it's completely normal to have anxiety, but generalized anxiety disorder is kind of having that and multiplying it by like 1,000. Some symptoms of this anxiety can be feeling restless, feeling on edge, feeling like you can't relax. It's very difficult to kind of concentrate on things. People tend to also have like some muscle tension, being irritable, having sleep issues. So bottom line is, GAD is just feeling anxious about a lot of stuff, and it's not very fun. The age of onset tends to be 8.5 years old, and the prevalence rate tends to be around 2%. And in regards to gender differences, it tends to vary and change a lot, especially during the teen years. And one more type of anxiety disorder is OCD, which is a video that I had already done, so I can link it up there for you guys if you want to go check it out. So in regards to treatment, there's a lot of different things that you can do. I'm going to just be talking about 3 different methods. The first one being therapy, the second one being self-care, and the third one being medication. So in regards to therapy, the most common one is cognitive behavioral therapy, otherwise known as CBT. The second one is self-care. There's a lot of things on the internet, a lot of things that many people can say that you can do, like journaling, meditation, yoga, exercise, all that kind of stuff. But the thing that helps me the most with this grounding technique, it's called the 5 4 3 2 1 grounding technique. I don't really know if it's like there's a real name to it, but this is what my therapist had recommended me to do, and this has saved me and has helped me so much. So the 5 4 3 2 1 grounding method is kind of using your 5 senses to find 5 things around you that you can see, 4 things that you can touch around you, 3 things that you can hear around you, 2 things that you can smell around you, and 1 thing that you can taste. So basically it's just using all of your 5 senses to take you from here to coming back and grounding you back. So the last form of treatment that I'm going to be talking about are medication. The 2 most common ones are SSRIs and antidepressants. Okay, so that is all I have for this video. I know it was a lot, and I hope that I kind of broken down and made it easy to understand but still be educational and informative. Just some final notes that I want to make before we close up this video. It's very normal to feel anxious because look at the world that we're living in. It's inevitable to not be like anxious to some degree. The best thing you can do is to face it head on, be aware of it, conscious of it, not let it take over. You control it, it doesn't control you. And lastly, help is always the best thing that you can do. Going to therapy, going to a psychologist, going to a counselor, a trained professional, they're amazing. But if you can't afford that or you don't want to, I can just offer my help. My email is in the description down below. If you ever just want to rant or have somebody to talk to, I am always here, always available. And if not, you can always DM me on Instagram. I am more than happy to offer advice, any help that I can. I'm here for you. So anyways, that is the end of this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you did, make sure to leave a thumbs up down below. It really helps with my engagement, helps to get my videos pushed out there. And if you're new, subscribe, push that bell for post notifications so you'll be notified every single time that I post. And I will see you guys in my next one. Bye!